The alien princess lay on the cold, dusty ground, her small body shivering from exhaustion. Yuria, once a royal child of the grand Sci-Fi Empire, had lost everything. The palace, the servants, the luxurious halls, everything was gone. She had been abandoned, left to die on this lonely, barren planet. Her large violet eyes filled with unshed tears as she curled up against a broken piece of metal, trying to keep warm. The winds howled, carrying the scent of dust and decay. She had not eaten in days. Her once silky silver hair was tangled and dirty, her delicate robes torn and stained. "Someone will come for me. Someone has to," she whispered, her voice weak. But deep inside, she knew the truth. No one was coming. The empire had fallen into chaos. The new rulers saw her as a threat, a living symbol of the old dynasty. They didn't need her alive. The guards, once sworn to protect her, had turned their backs. Even the noble families who once bowed before her had refused to help. She was alone, completely alone. A small sound broke through the silence, a rustling in the distance. Yuria tensed, her heart racing. Was it another scavenger? Or worse, bounty hunters looking for an easy reward? She tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. She could barely move. If someone was coming, she had no way to defend herself. The sound grew louder. Footsteps on the dry, cracked earth. Then a low, deep growl. Yuria froze. Emerging from the shadows was a creature unlike anything she had ever seen before. A large, powerful beast with thick fur, scars across its body, and glowing amber eyes. Its ears flicked, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Yuria swallowed hard. This was no ordinary animal. It was a human war dog, a beast trained by humans for battle, one of the strongest warriors' companions. She had heard of them before, fearless, loyal, and nearly unstoppable. But this one was alone, just like her. The dog sniffed the air again, its sharp gaze locking onto her. Yuria held her breath. Was it dangerous? Would it attack her? But then, something unexpected happened. The dog whined softly, stepping closer. It lowered its head, staring at her with something almost gentle in its eyes. Yuria didn't move. Her small hands trembled as the dog leaned forward and nudged her with its nose. Warm, soft, not a monster, not an enemy. The dog was checking on her. Tears welled up in Yuria's eyes. For the first time since she had been abandoned, someone was showing her kindness. The dog sniffed her once more before it did something that completely stunned her. It lay down beside her, curling its strong body around her small frame, blocking the cold wind. Yuria gasped softly. It was protecting her, keeping her warm. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers brushed against its rough fur. The dog didn't move away. It didn't growl or snap. It simply lay there, watching over her. Yuria buried her face into its fur, a quiet sob escaping her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. The dog let out a small huff, as if understanding. In that moment, she realized something. She was not alone anymore. Maybe she had lost her people, her kingdom, and everything she had ever known. But she had found a new protector. And maybe, just maybe, this war dog had found something too. A purpose, a reason to keep going. Two abandoned souls, brought together by fate. The night grew darker, but Yuria no longer felt as scared. For the first time in a long time, she had hope. And with this loyal guardian beside her, she knew she would survive. No matter what. Yuria woke up to the feeling of warm fur against her cheek. The war dog was still beside her, breathing softly, its large body shielding her from the cold wind. For the first time in many days, she had slept without fear. She slowly sat up, her body aching from hunger and exhaustion. The dog lifted its head, its amber eyes watching her closely. You stayed," she whispered, surprised. The dog didn't answer, of course, but its tail gave a small wag. It wasn't just a wild animal. It was trained. It had once belonged to someone, most likely a human soldier. But now it was alone, just like her. Yuria looked around. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the barren land. She had to find food. If she stayed weak, she wouldn't survive for long. But where could she go? She had no weapons, no supplies, and no idea how far civilization was. Her stomach growled, making her wince. The dog's ears perked up. It stood, shook its thick fur, and then started sniffing the ground. A moment later, it turned to her and let out a short bark. Yuria blinked. "You want me to follow you?" The dog barked again, then trotted ahead a few steps before looking back. She hesitated. Was it safe? What if it led her into danger? But then again, staying here would mean certain death. She took a deep breath and forced herself to stand. Her legs wobbled, but she didn't fall. "All right," she whispered. "I'll trust you." The dog's tail wagged again, and it turned, leading the way. A silent understanding. Yuria followed the dog across the rocky terrain. Every step was painful, but she kept moving. The dog stopped occasionally, sniffing the air, its ears twitching at every sound. It was watching for danger. After some time, they reached an area with low, twisted trees and dry bushes. The dog sniffed around before suddenly digging into the ground. Yuria frowned. "What are you doing?" A moment later, the dog pulled out something, a small half-buried container. Yuria's eyes widened. It was a human supply box. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, and to her relief, it clicked open. Inside, she found dried food packets, a small water bottle, and a worn-out emergency blanket. Tears filled her eyes. It wasn't much, but to her, it was everything. She looked at the dog. "You found this for me." The dog simply sat down, tongue hanging out, as if proud of itself. Yuria let out a soft laugh, her first in a long time. She quickly tore open one of the food packets and took a bite. It was dry and tasteless, but she didn't care. She ate like it was the best meal in the universe. She glanced at the dog. It had saved her life again. With a grateful heart, she broke off a piece of the food and held it out. "Here, you must be hungry too." The dog tilted its head but didn't take it. Instead, it gave a short, firm bark. Yuria blinked. You won't eat." It barked again, then sat tall, eyes scanning the surroundings. It was protecting her. A lump formed in Yuria's throat. "You really are loyal, aren't you?" She finished eating quickly and drank some water. Feeling a little stronger, she wrapped the emergency blanket around herself. It was thin, but it helped. The dog finally lay down beside her, its body warm against her side. For the first time in days, Yuria didn't feel weak. She didn't feel alone. A dangerous world. As the day passed, Yuria and the dog continued walking. They had no clear destination, but the dog seemed to know where it was going. But danger was never far. As they moved through a narrow canyon, a sudden sound made Yuria freeze. Footsteps. She pressed herself against the rock wall, her heart pounding. The dog stood alert, ears perked, tail stiff. Then, voices. She couldn't have gotten far. "If we find her, we get a reward, dead or alive." Yuria's blood ran cold. Bounty hunters. She turned to the dog, panic rising in her chest. The dog didn't move. It simply lowered its body, muscles tensed, ready to fight if needed. Yuria barely dared to breathe. The voices grew closer. Shadows stretched across the canyon walls. If they saw her, it would be over. She gripped the dog's fur, whispering, "What do we do?" The dog looked at her, then made a low, rumbling growl. And in that moment, Yuria realized something. This dog was not just her companion. It was her guardian, and it was ready to fight for her. Yuria pressed her back against the cold canyon wall, her heart pounding in her chest. The voices of the bounty hunters echoed through the narrow passage, their footsteps growing louder. She knew they were looking for her. Her small fingers gripped the thick fur of the war dog beside her. He was still, completely focused on the approaching danger. His ears twitched, his muscles tensed, and his amber eyes glowed in the dim light. The dog, her only protector, was ready to fight. The hunters approach. Yuria peeked around the edge of the rock. 3 bounty hunters were searching the area. They were tall, covered in dark armor, their faces hidden under helmets. Each carried a blaster rifle, scanning the surroundings. "She was last seen near here," one of them muttered. "She couldn't have gone far." "If we find her first, we'll get paid double," another replied. Yuria swallowed hard. If they found her, she wouldn't stand a chance. The dog growled softly beside her. Yuria gently placed a hand on his back, feeling his strong heartbeat. "We have to run," she whispered. But as soon as she moved, a rock slipped under her foot. It tumbled down the canyon, hitting the ground with a loud clack. The bounty hunters snapped their heads toward the sound. "There," one of them shouted. Yuria's breath caught in her throat. She had been spotted. The hunters raised their weapons. VZZT. A bright energy shot exploded against the rock, just inches from where she was hiding. Yuria gasped. They were shooting to kill. Before she could react, the dog leaped forward with a ferocious snarl, his powerful legs pushing off the ground like a shadowy blur. The battle begins. The first bounty hunter barely had time to react before the war dog slammed into him, knocking him off his feet. The man yelled in shock as the dog's sharp teeth sank into his armored arm, tearing at the metal. "Get it off me," he screamed. The second hunter aimed his blaster at the dog. "No," Yuria cried. Without thinking, she grabbed a small rock from the ground and threw it with all her strength. It struck the second hunter's helmet with a hard crack, making him stumble. The dog took the chance. He lunged at the second bounty hunter, his powerful jaws clamping around the man's wrist. The blaster clattered to the ground. The third hunter, the tallest of them all, didn't hesitate. He lifted a large shock baton, electricity crackling at its tip. Yuria's eyes widened in horror. "Look out!" But the dog was faster. He dodged the incoming strike, twisting his body with trained precision. Then, with a single leap, he tackled the last bounty hunter to the ground. The man grunted, trying to push the beast off, but the war dog refused to let go. His fangs tore through armor, and his deep, powerful growl filled the canyon. The first bounty hunter, still struggling to stand, reached for his weapon. Yuria knew she had to do something. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to move. She grabbed the fallen blaster rifle from the second hunter and lifted it. It was heavier than she expected. Her arms shook. The first bounty hunter turned his weapon toward the dog. Yuria took a shaky breath, then pulled the trigger. BZZT. A bolt of blue energy shot from the rifle and struck the bounty hunter's shoulder. He cried out in pain, dropping his weapon. The dog took full advantage, knocking him unconscious with a powerful strike of his paws. The canyon fell silent. The last of the bounty hunters lay motionless on the ground. Yuria lowered the blaster, her hands still trembling. She had never held a weapon before, never even thought about fighting. But today, she had no choice. She turned to the dog. His fur was matted with dust, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He was panting, but his eyes remained locked on her, as if making sure she was safe. Yuria knelt beside him and buried her fingers into his thick fur. "You saved me," she whispered. The dog simply huffed and nudged her hand with his nose. For the first time in a long time, she smiled. A new challenge. They didn't have much time. More bounty hunters would come looking. Yuria quickly searched the unconscious hunters. She found a small pouch of food, a map, and a communication device. She stuffed them into her torn cloak and turned to the dog. "We have to leave." He wagged his tail once and started walking ahead, leading the way. Yuria took a deep breath and followed. For the first time since her escape, She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting to survive. And with her loyal war dog beside her, she knew she had a chance. Uria's legs felt heavy as she walked through the rocky path, her breath coming in short gasps. The fight with the bounty hunters had drained her energy, and her small body was still weak from hunger and exhaustion. But she couldn't stop now. Beside her, the war dog moved with steady steps, his large paws making almost no sound on the rough ground. His fur was dirty, and there were scratches on his body, but he didn't seem to care. He was focused on one thing: protecting her. The stolen map she had taken from the bounty hunters showed a human military outpost not far from their location. If they could reach it, maybe she could find shelter. Maybe she could find someone to help her. But they never made it that far. The ambush. The moment they stepped out of the canyon, a loud buzzing sound filled the air. Uria barely had time to react before a glowing energy net shot from the sky, wrapping tightly around her body. She screamed as the force of the net knocked her to the ground. The war dog barked and lunged at the attackers, but another net shot down, trapping him as well. Uria struggled, but the more she moved, the tighter the net became. The energy pulsed against her skin, making her weak. Heavy boots stomped toward her. She looked up and saw 3 more bounty hunters, bigger and stronger than the ones before. One of them smirked. Found her. Uria's heart sank. Taken. The bounty hunters carried her and the dog into a large metal ship, locking them inside a small cell. Uria pressed her hands against the cold metal bars, her chest tightening. She had come so far. She had survived so much, and now it was over. She turned to the war dog. He lay quietly on the floor, watching the door with sharp, calculating eyes. Uria swallowed her fear. No, it wasn't over. Not yet. The bounty hunters talked outside the cell, their voices muffled. She's worth a lot of credits. The buyers want her alive. What about the dog? Gladiator arenas love war dogs. He'll sell for a fortune. Uria clenched her fists. They were going to separate them. They were going to take the only friend she had left. She couldn't let that happen. The plan. She looked around the cell, searching for anything she could use. The only things inside were a metal plate for food and a loose wire sticking out of the wall. An idea formed in her mind. It was dangerous, but it was their only chance. She crawled toward the wire and carefully pulled it free. Sparks flew, but she didn't stop. The war dog lifted his head, watching her. Uria smiled. Don't worry. I have a plan. Using the wire, she poked at the control panel of the cell door. She had seen palace engineers work on things like this before. If she could just. A small spark. Then a soft click. The door slid open. Uria's eyes widened. It worked. She ran to the war dog's net and used the same wire to cut through the energy field. The moment the net fell, the dog jumped to his feet, shaking his fur. He was free. But they still had to escape the ship. The Great Escape. Uria peeked out of the cell. The bounty hunters were distracted, arguing over the price of their prisoners. She took a deep breath, then whispered, "Go." The war dog lunged forward with a deep growl, his powerful body slamming into the nearest hunter. The man shouted in shock as he fell to the ground. Another bounty hunter spun around, reaching for his weapon, but Uria was faster. She grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and swung it hard against his arm. He yelped, dropping his blaster. The third hunter raised his gun, but the war dog jumped at him, knocking him down before he could fire. Uria grabbed the fallen blaster and pointed it at the door panel. She fired. Boom! The blast short-circuited the entire control system, plunging the ship into darkness. Alarms started blaring. The war dog barked and nudged her forward. They ran. A leap of faith. They reached the ship's exit, but it was still in the air, hovering over a rocky desert. Uria hesitated. It was too high. The war dog didn't. Without a second thought, he grabbed her cloak in his teeth and jumped. Yuria screamed as they plunged into the air, the ground rushing toward them. But the dog twisted mid-fall, shielding her with his body. They crashed into a sand dune, rolling down the slope before coming to a stop. Yuria coughed, spitting out sand. She was alive. They were alive. The war dog shook himself off, then turned to her, wagging his tail. Yuria laughed breathlessly. "You're crazy," he huffed. Then, as they looked back, they saw the bounty hunter's ship crashing into the ground, smoke rising into the sky. They had done it. They had escaped. And now, their journey was far from over. Yuria's heart was still pounding as she lay in the soft sand, trying to catch her breath. The war dog, covered in dust, stood beside her, his ears alert and his amber eyes scanning the area. They had escaped the ship, but they were not safe yet. The sky above them was filled with thick smoke from the bounty hunter's crashed ship. The wreckage burned in the distance, but Yuria knew it wouldn't take long before more hunters came searching for them. "We have to keep moving," she whispered. The war dog huffed in agreement and nudged her gently with his nose, urging her to get up. Yuria pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking from exhaustion. Her small hands clutched the stolen blaster she had taken during their escape. She didn't know how to use it well, but if she had to, she would fight. They started walking. The land stretched endlessly before them, a vast desert wasteland with no shelter in sight. The sun was harsh, beating down on them, and every step felt heavier. Yuria glanced at the map she had stolen from the bounty hunters. It showed an old human military outpost not far from here. If they could reach it, they might find supplies, maybe even a way off this planet. She looked at the war dog, his thick fur already coated in dust. He was strong, but she could tell he was tired too. "We'll find water soon," she told him, more to keep herself hopeful than anything else. The dog wagged his tail slightly, but his ears remained high, always listening for danger. Hunters in the sky. As they walked, a low humming noise filled the air. Yuria's body froze. She knew that sound. She looked up and saw a small bounty hunter drone flying overhead, scanning the ground. Her heart clenched. They were already searching for her. She grabbed the war dog's fur and whispered, "Hide." They ran toward a pile of broken rocks and crouched low. Yuria pulled the emergency blanket she had taken from the bounty hunter's supplies and covered them both. It wasn't perfect, but from a distance, it blended with the sand. The drone hovered for a moment, its red lights blinking as it scanned the area. Yuria held her breath. If it detected them, they were finished. The war dog remained completely still, his body tense, as if he knew what was at stake. After a few seconds, the drone moved away, flying toward the wrecked ship. Yuria let out a quiet sigh of relief, but she knew this was only the beginning. More hunters would come. The hidden shelter. They continued moving, pushing through the heat. Hours passed. Yuria's throat was dry, and her feet ached. She couldn't go on much longer. The war dog suddenly stopped and sniffed the air. His ears twitched. "What is it?" Yuria asked weakly. Without warning, he took off toward a large boulder in the distance. Yuria forced herself to follow. When she reached the boulder, she gasped. Behind it, a hidden entrance led underground. A rusty metal hatch was half buried in the sand. The war dog scratched at it, sniffing around. Yuria bent down and brushed away the sand. The hatch was old, but she found a small control panel beside it. She pressed a few buttons, hoping it still worked. The screen flickered, then beeped weakly. With a loud creak, the hatch unlocked. Yuria's heart raced with excitement. This could be a real shelter. She pulled it open and peered inside. The space below was dark, but the air felt cooler, and she could hear the faint drip of water. She turned to the war dog and grinned. "You're a genius." The dog huffed proudly. They climbed inside, shutting the hatch behind them. A forgotten place. The underground shelter was small but safe. The walls were made of metal, covered in dust. There were old human crates stacked in the corners, likely from soldiers who had once used this place. Yuria spotted a water container and rushed toward it. She pressed the muzzle, and clean water dripped out. She almost cried. She filled a small cup and drank greedily before giving some to the war dog. He lapped it up quickly, his tail wagging for the first time in a while. For a moment, they both just sat there, breathing. But Yuria knew they couldn't stay forever. She searched through the crates, hoping to find something useful. Inside one, she found a communicator, damaged, but maybe repairable. If she could fix it, she could send a message. She turned to the war dog. "We might have a way out of here." He wagged his tail and sat beside her, as if telling her he would follow wherever she went. Yuria took a deep breath. They had survived again, but the real fight was far from over. Yuria sat on the cold metal floor of the underground shelter, staring at the broken communicator in her hands. It was old and dusty, but it still had power. If she could fix it, she might be able to send a distress signal to the nearest human outpost. The war dog sat beside her, his amber eyes watching closely as if he understood what she was trying to do. She sighed. "I don't know much about human technology, but I have to try." With careful hands, she opened the back panel, exposing tangled wires and a cracked circuit board. It was damaged, but not beyond repair. She looked around the shelter and found an old toolbox inside one of the crates. A screwdriver, some wire cutters, and a few spare parts. "This might work," she whispered. The war dog wagged his tail slightly, as if encouraging her. Yuria took a deep breath and started working. A race against time. She had no idea how long she had been fixing the communicator, but her hands were sore and sweat dripped from her forehead. The only sounds in the shelter were the occasional drip of water and the war dog's quiet breathing. Then, a beep. Yuria's heart skipped a beat. She quickly adjusted the small antenna and tapped the screen. A weak signal appeared, faint, unstable, but it was there. She grabbed the microphone and pressed the button. "This is Yuria of the Zephyrian royal family," she said, her voice shaking. "I need help. If anyone hears this, please. BEP, Saijigen Ale, lost." No. Yuria tried to restart it, but the screen flickered and went dark. The communicator was dead. Her hands clenched into fists. She had come so far, and now she had no way of calling for help. The war dog let out a small whine and nuzzled her arm. She sighed and ran a hand through his fur. "At least we tried." But then, boom. The ground shook violently, dust falling from the ceiling. Yuria's blood ran cold. Something was outside. The war dog was already on his feet, growling. His ears twitched, listening. Then, from above, a metal clang. Yuria's breath caught in her throat. The hatch was being opened. The battle begins. She grabbed the blaster she had stolen from the bounty hunters and aimed at the entrance, her hands trembling. The war dog crouched low, muscles tense, ready to strike. Then, the hatch burst open. A bounty hunter dropped inside, his armor gleaming under the dim lights. Behind him, more shadows loomed above. Yuria didn't hesitate. She fired. The energy blast hit the bounty hunter's shoulder, making him stumble. The war dog lunged, knocking the enemy to the ground before he could recover. More bounty hunters jumped down, weapons raised. Yuria knew they were outnumbered, but she also knew they weren't giving up without a fight. The last stand. The war dog moved like a shadow, dodging attacks, knocking down enemies with his powerful body. Yuria ducked behind a crate, firing whenever she had the chance. She wasn't a skilled fighter, but she was fast, and she used the small space of the shelter to her advantage. A bounty hunter charged toward her. She grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and swung it with all her strength, hitting him across the helmet. He fell with a loud thud, but there were too many. One of them raised a shock baton, aiming for the war dog. "No!" Yuria screamed. The dog dodged at the last second, biting down on the enemy's arm. Another hunter grabbed Yuria from behind, yanking her off her feet. She kicked and struggled, but he was too strong. Just as he was about to drag her away, bang! A bright flash of blue light filled the room. Yuria blinked in confusion. The bounty hunter holding her collapsed to the ground. She looked up and gasped. A group of human soldiers stood at the entrance, weapons raised. Rescue arrives. Target secured, one of them said. Yuria's chest tightened. You heard my signal. The soldier nodded. Barely, but we tracked the source. He glanced at the bounty hunters lying on the floor. Looks like you held out just fine. Yuria let out a shaky laugh, still in shock. The war dog stood beside her, panting but unharmed. A soldier knelt and scratched behind his ears. That's a fine war dog you've got there. Yuria smiled. He saved my life. The soldier grinned. Then I'd say he's a hero. As more soldiers secured the area, Yuria finally allowed herself to breathe. She had survived. And she hadn't done it alone. She looked down at the war dog and whispered, "We made it." He wagged his tail. But she knew this was only the beginning. Yuria sat in the human transport ship, wrapped in a warm blanket. The soft hum of the engines filled the air, and for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Across from her, the war dog lay with his head resting on his paws. His fur was still dirty, and there were scratches on his body, but his eyes were calm. He was no longer just a wandering soldier. He was her protector. A human soldier, Captain Rylan, approached her with a small smile. He was tall, with short brown hair and kind eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Yuria nodded. "Better." Rylan handed her a small packet of food. "Here, eat this. You need your strength." She hesitated but took it. As she unwrapped the packet, the smell of warm bread and dried fruit made her stomach growl. She hadn't had real food in so long. The war dog lifted his head, sniffing the air. Yuria smiled and broke off a piece of bread, offering it to him. He took it gently, chewing slowly. Rylan chuckled. "He really is loyal to you." Yuria ran her fingers through the dog's fur. "He saved my life, over and over again." The captain's face grew serious. "You're lucky. Not many survive after being hunted like that." He paused. "Do you know why they wanted you?" Yuria lowered her gaze. "Because of who I am." Rylan sighed. "A Zyfarian princess. That explains it." She tensed, expecting him to treat her differently now. But instead, he simply said, "Well, you're safe now." The choice. After she finished eating, Yuria looked out the small window. The stars shone brightly, and a large space station loomed in the distance. "That's the human colony of Nova 4, Rylan said. "It's where we're taking you." Yuria blinked. "A human colony." He nodded. "It's not home, but it's a fresh start. You'll be protected there." Yuria's heart pounded. A new home. She had never considered what would happen after escaping. She had been so focused on surviving that she hadn't thought about living. "What about him?" she asked, nodding toward the war dog. Rylan smiled. "He's yours, a soldier's best friend, and I'd say he chose you." Yuria looked at the dog, who wagged his tail slightly. A warmth spread in her chest. He had saved her. He had stayed with her. And now, she would stay with him. She reached out and scratched behind his ears. "Looks like we're sticking together." The dog let out a small huff, as if saying he had already decided that a long time ago. A new beginning. When the ship landed on Nova 4, Yuria stepped out, her feet touching solid ground. The colony was beautiful. Tall white buildings, lush green trees, and people walking freely in the streets. It was nothing like the cold palace she had once lived in. Rylan led her through the colony, introducing her to the people. Unlike her own kind, who had abandoned her, these humans welcomed her without fear or judgment. "You're one of us now," Rylan told her. Yuria felt a lump in her throat. One of them. She wasn't just an abandoned princess anymore. She wasn't alone. She looked down at the war dog walking beside her, his tail wagging as he sniffed the air. For the first time in her life, she had a family. The legend of the war dog and the princess. Days turned into weeks. Yuria adjusted to life in the human colony. She learned about human technology, their culture, and even their history. But she never forgot where she came from. She never forgot what she had lost. And most of all, she never forgot who saved her. The war dog became a legend among the people of Nova 4. They called him the loyal soldier, the beast who had defied death to protect a princess. And Yuria. She trained. She studied. She grew stronger. She was no longer a helpless girl waiting to be rescued. One day, she would face the ones who had abandoned her. One day, she would reclaim her place in the universe. But for now, she was home. And she was finally free. The end.